After being reborn, I had three thoughts. First, be kinder to my stepmother and stepbrother. Second, study hard. Third, stay away from Stanley. I succeeded with the first two, but the third didn't go as planned. Because Stanley was reborn too. Chapter 1. The moment I saw Stanley walk into the classroom, I knew I had been reborn. The 18-year-old Stanley still had a trace of youthful innocence, somewhat different from the man who discarded me after using me, leading to my family's ruin 10 years later. The homeroom teacher smiled as she introduced the new student. This is Stanley, who just transferred to our class. Let's all get along well. These words were exactly the same as in my previous life. I knew what would happen next. The homeroom teacher would have Stanley sit next to me because my desk mate had just transferred, leaving the only available seat next to me. It was the same in my previous life. After becoming desk mates, Stanley was surprisingly kind to me. We quickly became close. Knowing about his tragic background made me feel even more sympathetic, and I wanted to help him as much as I could. Putting aside the awful things he did later, Stanley was very handsome and capable, so my initial sympathy gradually turned into affection. After the college entrance exams, I confessed my feelings to Stanley, and we naturally ended up together. Until 10 years later, when my family went bankrupt, and Stanley discarded me like trash, turning to get engaged to someone else. It wasn't until the day of his engagement that I found out he had planned everything. He used me to gain my father's trust, then caused my family's bankruptcy and took over my company. He did it all to prove himself to his father and secure his position in the Smith family. 10 years of my sincere feelings and generations of wealth accumulated by my York family all became stepping stones for Stanley. In the end, my father jumped off a building, and I died in a car accident on my way to the hospital to see him one last time. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the very beginning of it all. Stanley, you can sit next to Julia for now. As Stanley walked closer, I reflexively stood up. Stanley, who was about to sit down, paused. He looked at me with confusion in his eyes. The homeroom teacher asked, "What's wrong?" I took a step back to distance myself from Stanley. I don't want to sit next to him. I want to change seats. Hearing this, Stanley's pupils trembled, and the homeroom teacher frowned in displeasure. The classmates around me whispered, "What's wrong with Julia today? She's usually so nice. Julia, let Stanley sit next to you for now. We'll rearrange seats after the monthly exam." I ignored the homeroom teacher's words and scanned the classroom. Everyone was staring at me like they were watching a show, except for him, who was sitting at the back, completely absorbed in his own work. It was as if nothing around him mattered. I didn't want to disturb him, but I had no other choice. "Teacher, I want to sit with Mike." At these words, Mike, who had been indifferent all along, finally looked up, his gaze sweeping across my face. "I want to study hard, so I want to sit with Mike and have him tutor me." I was worried this reason wasn't convincing enough, so I added, "My dad has already agreed, and Mike knows about it too. We just haven't had the chance to tell you yet. My dad donates to the school every year, so even if the teacher doesn't care about me, she has to give my dad some face." She looked at Mike, seeking confirmation. I also looked at him. Mike stared blankly at me for a few seconds, and when I blinked at him pleadingly, he nodded and said, "Okay." After changing seats, Mike remained distant, almost avoiding me. I could understand why. After all, I had always rejected him and his mother since she became my stepmother, and I never treated them kindly. But in my previous life, after my family's downfall, it was Mike and his mother who held our crumbling household together. So in this life, I decided to be kinder to my stepmother and stepbrother. "Stop staring." Mike blushed and whispered. I realized I had been staring at him for a while. It seemed like he had made a big decision as he turned to look at me seriously and asked, "Why do you suddenly want to be desk mates with me? Don't you?" He didn't finish the words "hate me the most," but I could guess what he meant. I smiled and casually opened the book in front of me. I already said, I want to study hard. This wasn't a lie. In my previous life, I was useless. After the accident, not only did I fail to help my family, but I also became a burden. So in this life, I must study hard. If something similar happens again, I want to be someone they can rely on. What about you? I asked him. Why did you help me lie to the teacher? Mike lowered his head again. After a brief pause, he said, my mom asked me to take care of you at school. I had already guessed this reason. Aunt May had always treated me well. I'll take care of you too, Mike. Mike quickly glanced at me, his ears turning red, but there was a faint smile on his lips. Chapter 2. In my previous life, I was a terrible student who got into the advanced class through connections. Even in this new life, I still find high school subjects challenging. Mike has glanced at me several times. When he looks at me and my exercise book again, I suddenly turn my head to meet his eyes. Mike, I don't know how to do this. Can you teach me? He didn't hesitate, as if he had been waiting for me to ask. Sure. When explaining the problems, Mike spoke softly. Even when I asked him the most basic questions, he patiently answered them. Take notes on these, and next time, just use the formula. I was slow at solving problems, and when I finally looked up, I realized he had been watching me the entire time. Yes, you got it right. Mike's lips curved into a faint smile. He really doesn't hold grudges, whether in this life or the last. I don't know if it was because I got a question right or if it was Mike's smile that lifted my spirits, but I suddenly felt inexplicably cheerful, and even wanted to tease him a little. Mike, why don't you call me sis anymore? I remember when his mom first brought him to our house, he was only 12. The first time we met, he timidly called me sister. For a long time after that, even when I treated him coldly, he still insisted on calling me sis. But later on, I don't know when it started, but I never heard him call me that again. Upon hearing my question, the smile on Mike's face suddenly froze, and he gave me a complicated look. Didn't you tell me not to call you that? I had already forgotten about that. Feeling awkward, I rubbed my nose. Then, in a soft voice, as if coaxing a child, I said, how about you start calling me sis again? I was wrong before, I was just joking. Mike, please start calling me sis again. I like hearing you call me that. Boys his age are easy to coax. Mike turned his head away, and from my angle, I could only see his reddened ears. In the next moment, I heard him softly reply, okay. I pushed my luck, then say it now. After staring at him for a while, I finally heard him reluctantly utter a single word, sis. Just that one word was enough to please me. As I turned back to continue with my work, I sensed a gaze that seemed to be fixed on me from behind. I turned around and met Stanley's eyes. He probably didn't expect me to suddenly turn around, so the gloom on his face hadn't yet faded. But in just a blink, Stanley's expression returned to normal. He smiled at me politely, but I found his smile to be both fake and disgusting. Expressionless, I turned back. Mike glanced at Stanley and reminded me, let's finish these problems first. Sis. My earlier good mood vanished, and even his call of sis couldn't restore it. I looked at the problems he'd marked in the workbook and quietly replied, okay. After school, I found the private car that was supposed to pick me up, just as I remembered from my past life. Miss, please get in. Seeing the familiar face of the driver, the joy of being reborn filled my heart again. I glanced towards the school. Let's wait a bit. Mike was called by the teacher, we'll wait for him. The driver looked at me with some surprise but didn't say anything. Julia. A familiar voice suddenly called from behind me, and I froze. I lost my bus card. Can I borrow $2 for the bus? This scene had happened in my previous life too. In my past life, Stanley had said the same thing to me. Out of consideration for our deskmate status, I asked for his address. After finding out that he lived in the same neighborhood as me, I invited him to share a ride home. After arriving at the neighborhood and encountering some acquaintances, he introduced me as his friend. Being friends with the young lady of the York family. With just that, this awkwardly positioned illegitimate child could finally gain a little recognition in the Smith family. In my previous life, I thought it was all a coincidence, but now, looking back, I feel like everything was deliberate. Seeing that I hadn't responded, Stanley called out again, Julia? I directly ignored him and waved at Mike, who had just walked out of the school gate. I've been waiting for you. Let's go home together. Mike glanced at Stanley behind me, then ran over with a surprised expression. You waited for me? Sis. Yeah. I nodded and got in the car first. Even though my reaction now was completely different from my past life, Stanley still wouldn't give up. He stepped forward, grabbed the car door, and repeated, Julia, can I borrow $2 for the bus? I frowned and looked at him coldly, saying in an unhappy tone, I don't lend money to strangers. Sorry. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Stanley still standing there, looking puzzled and dejected. Chapter 3. As soon as I got home, I saw my dad setting the table. Memories from my past life flooded back, and my nose tingled with emotion. I rushed over and hugged him tightly. Dad. Seeing me cry, my dad frantically tried to comfort me. Even Aunt May, who was in the kitchen, ran over nervously and surrounded me. Julia, what's wrong? Did someone bully you at school? She grabbed Mike and asked him, but Mike just looked at me, equally bewildered, and shook his head. During dinner, Mike handed me a bowl of soup. Sis. I reached out to take it and casually said, thanks. It was just a simple word, but the 3 people at the table acted as if it were a big deal. Most of the dishes on the table were my favorites. After tasting them, I sincerely said, the food is really good today. Aunt May smiled as she put down her chopsticks, glancing at my dad and then at me. The housekeeper took a day off today, so I cooked. I'm glad you like it. In my previous life, I always held a grudge against Aunt May and Mike, so I never ate Aunt May's cooking. I even lost my temper and flipped the table once because of it. Julia, if you like it, Aunt May can cook for you again tomorrow, okay? Aunt May cautiously tested the waters. The dining table suddenly went quiet, and everyone seemed to freeze in place. Meeting their hopeful gazes, I smiled and nodded, okay. All night long, my dad and Aunt May were overjoyed, with smiles never leaving their faces. Even Mike hovered around me, pouring water and bringing me fruit, and he called me sis several more times. As I was about to leave, I overheard Aunt May chatting with my dad. I heard the Smith family brought back an illegitimate child. He's in a tough spot. My dad didn't seem to care. That's none of our business. As long as our family stays happy and harmonious, that's all that matters. Dad, Aunt May, I'm taking the dog out for a walk, I said to them as they sat on the sofa. After changing my shoes, I noticed Mike following me to change his shoes too. Where are you going? Mike grinned at me. Sis, I'm going for a run. After reminding me to be careful, he took off running. I hadn't walked far when I saw someone standing under the shadow of a tree up ahead. I stared at that figure for 10 years, so it was naturally familiar to me. It was Stanley. I ignored him and continued walking forward, but it was clear that Stanley had deliberately waited here. Julia, he called out to me. Seeing that I didn't respond, Stanley reached out to grab me, but he was startled by my golden retriever. Julia, there's something I want to ask you. The golden retriever was still baring its teeth and barking at him. As I tightened the leash, I responded indifferently, classmate, we don't know each other. There's nothing to talk about, is there? Just as Stanley was about to say something else, Mike's voice came from not far away. He quickly ran over, casting a hostile glance at Stanley before looking at me. Sis, what's going on? I heard Roundy barking. Nothing. I tugged the golden retriever to leave when a black sedan suddenly pulled up beside us. The person who got out of the car was Stanley's father. Stanley, what are you doing out here? After speaking, he pretended to notice me for the first time, feigning enthusiasm. Isn't this the York family's young lady? I've been meaning to visit your father. Stanley is my son. Do you know each other? We don't know each other. Mike and I said in unison. I've been through this scenario once before. Stanley somehow found out that I would take the dog out for a walk in the evening, so he specifically waited near my home. It was both to get closer to me and to ensure that when his father came home, he would see him associating with the only heir of the York family. Is it Mr. Smith? I spoke politely. Please keep a close eye on your son, he's scared my dog. Without waiting for the father and son to react, Mike and I had already left. Behind us, I could hear Stanley's father yelling, "You brat, stop scheming, and don't be like your mother, full of tricks. If it weren't for her threats, you wouldn't even be allowed through the Smith family doors." And Stanley remained silent throughout. It wasn't until we had walked some distance that the trailing gaze finally disappeared. "Sis, do you know that person?" Mike suddenly asked me. "I don't." Chapter 4. Stanley was good-looking and had excellent grades. He had only been at our school for a few weeks, yet every day there were swarms of girls coming to see him after class. Half of those girls outside the window were there to see Mike, and the other half were there for Stanley. Because of this, the boys in our class had quite a few complaints, but due to my attitude toward Mike, they could only vent their anger on Stanley. During gym class, while I was on my way to buy water from the shop, I saw Stanley cornered by a few boys behind a secluded part of the school building. When he saw me passing by, there was a plea for help in Stanley's eyes. But I merely glanced at him briefly before continuing on as if I hadn't seen anything. In my past life, I'd already endured enough lessons. Every time Stanley got into trouble, I was always the one who stood up for him. But in the end, my sincere efforts and protection didn't earn me a good outcome, did they? So in this life, I've decided to be indifferent, to be the bad guy. By doing nothing, Stanley will suffer enough. After returning to the classroom and completing one page of exercises, Mike came back. I handed him some tissues and water. "Why did you come back so soon?" As he unscrewed the bottle and tilted his head back to drink, I could clearly see his Adam's apple moving. Feeling a bit uneasy, I looked away. "Can you solve them all?" Mike glanced at the practice book in front of me and asked. Just as I was about to answer, I noticed the boys who had been bothering Stanley earlier also returning to the classroom. "Do you think there's something wrong with Stanley? Why did he deliberately provoke us earlier?" "Yeah, he was the one who picked a fight with us, but just when we were about to start, he apologized." Hearing this, I couldn't help but scoff inwardly. Stanley was really pulling out all the stops to get close to me. But what he didn't know was that inside this body was no longer the same 17-year-old Julia who was once innocent and kind-hearted. Chapter 5. On the weekend, Mike accompanied me to the library to study. We arrived late, and most of the seats in the library were already taken. After finally finding a vacant spot, I was about to ask if it was available when I realized it was Stanley. He noticed me too and moved his things aside, silently inviting us to sit down. Before I could say anything, Mike had already grabbed my wrist. "Sis, let's go to the second floor. There are seats up there." As we left, Mike shot a warning glance at Stanley. After finishing 2 practice tests, I stretched my sore neck and suddenly heard Mike whisper, "Sis, why did you suddenly want to study?" Flashes of my past life came to mind, and I forced a wry smile. "No reason, I just don't want to be useless anymore." With one hand propping up my chin, I looked down at the densely filled answers on the test paper. "You know, I had a dream. In the dream, my family suddenly faced a crisis, but I couldn't help at all. The person I used to love the most even said I was just a worthless waste of space." It was meant to be a casual confession, but unexpectedly, Mike took it seriously. He looked at me earnestly, his expression solemn. "It was just a dream. No matter what happens, Uncle would never say that about you." I shook my head. It wasn't my dad. After hearing my answer, Mike fell silent, thinking for a couple of seconds. Then he blushed and avoided my gaze. I wouldn't say that about you either." The gloom in my heart instantly lifted, and I couldn't help but laugh until my sides ached at the sight of Mike blushing. After finishing my homework, I got up to wander around the library. But before I could get far, a figure suddenly rushed toward me from behind, forcefully pulling me into the nearby emergency exit. I was about to cry for help when a hand covered my mouth. A familiar voice whispered in my ear, "It was Stanley. Julia, long time no see." He pinned me against the wall, his lips close to my ear, breathing heavily and somewhat excitedly. "You've been reborn too, haven't you?" I realized that Stanley might have overheard what I said to Mike earlier. But did he just say that he had been reborn too? "Julia, I came back for you." Stanley's eyes were filled with deep emotions, but I knew he was always good at pretending. My heart raced with fear as I pushed him away forcefully. Stanley, however, was relentless. He trapped me between him and the hallway wall once again. "Julia, let me explain what happened in our past life, okay? It's not what you think. The physical disparity between men and women was obvious, and I couldn't resist him. I had no choice but to pretend to comply for the time being. I asked him, then what is it? Wasn't it you, Stanley, who caused my family's downfall? His expression was one of extreme pain. After struggling to speak for a long time, all he could say was, I had my reasons. No matter how great your reasons are, they have nothing to do with me. Taking advantage of his lowered guard, I clenched the pen in my hand and stabbed it into his arm. Then I pushed him down the stairs. Stay away from me from now on. Don't dirty my sight. After saying that, I opened the emergency exit and fled, only to bump right into Mike's arms. He steadied me and, sensing my unease, softly reassured me, Sis, what's wrong? I shook my head, barely suppressing the trembling in my body. I'm fine. Let's go home. Mike glanced at the emergency exit door, his expression darkening slightly. Sis, you go ahead and wait for me. I'll be right back after using the restroom. I didn't think much of it and turned to head back to our seats. When Mike returned, I noticed the injury on his face. Why did you take so long? And what happened to your face? Mike lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. I fell in the restroom. As we descended from the second floor, we encountered Stanley again. He looked even more disheveled, with some unexplained bruises on his face. Seeing the injury on Mike's face, I instantly understood. When I cast a glance at Stanley, Mike stepped in front of me to block my view. Sis, don't look at him. He doesn't seem like a good person. Chapter 6. Julia, the homeroom teacher wants you to go to the office. Just as I was about to leave, Mike glanced at Stanley's seat and quickly picked up the stack of assignments that had just been collected. He called out to me, Sis, wait a moment. I'll go with you. When we arrived at the office, Stanley was already there. The physics teacher seemed to be discussing competition matters with him. From the moment I stepped in, Stanley's eyes were locked on me. Mike placed the assignments on the teacher's desk and, before leaving, reminded me, Sis, I'll be waiting for you outside. The homeroom teacher chuckled at his words, teasing, is our top student a sister's boy? Can't seem to leave his sister even for a moment, huh? Mike blushed but didn't refute, tacitly accepting the teacher's remark. However, before leaving, he shot a glance at Stanley. Julia, your grades have improved a lot recently. Keep up the good work. The homeroom teacher then gave me some additional study-related advice. When I left the office, Mike was nowhere to be seen, but Stanley was waiting at the staircase, clearly anticipating my arrival. I ignored him and continued on my way back to the classroom. But Stanley caught up with me and blocked my path. Didn't you used to hate your stepbrother the most? Why are you so close to him now? Julia, why has everything changed? Didn't you love me the most before? Why won't you even spare me a glance now? I scoffed, don't take yourself too seriously. As I tried to walk away again, Stanley grabbed my wrist, his voice hoarse. Julia, please give me another chance, okay? No. I tried to shake him off but couldn't. Hearing footsteps coming from the staircase, I warned Stanley, let go. He stared at me persistently, his eyes filled with sorrow. Sis. The footsteps belonged to Mike. His gaze fell on Stanley's hand gripping my wrist, and his eyes immediately turned fierce. He rushed over and pushed Stanley away. Sis, did he bully you? Seeing the slight redness on my wrist, Mike grabbed Stanley by the collar and threatened him in a deep voice, did you forget the last time I warned you? Stay away from my sister. Stanley sneered, the corners of his lips curling up. You still have the nerve to call her sister? Who doesn't know what's on your mind? Both of them were in bad moods, and soon they started fighting. Mike. I quickly intervened. Mike, who had been about to punch Stanley, suddenly paused. His eyes turned red as he looked at me with grievance. Sis. I walked over and pulled him away. Let's go, class is starting. Then I glanced at Stanley. It's not worth fighting with someone like him. Hearing this, Stanley's pupils trembled, and his eyes instantly filled with tears. Ever since I discovered that Stanley, like me, had been reborn, his appearances around me had become more frequent. Meanwhile, Mike's temper had visibly worsened. He had even gotten into public fights with Stanley multiple times. At school, rumors about me and Stanley were growing. When the homeroom teacher called me into the office again, I was already somewhat annoyed. This year is crucial for your senior year. I hope you all can focus on your studies. Lately, you two have been. Teacher, I rarely interrupted an elder so rudely. I have no interest in Stanley at all. But Stanley often harasses me, and it's seriously affecting my studies. He's causing me a lot of trouble. I hope you can talk to him. If you can't solve this, I'll have to ask my dad to come to school and talk to the principal. After I finished speaking, the homeroom teacher was momentarily stunned. Then she turned to Stanley. Is what Julia said true? Stanley remained silent for a moment, then nodded in acknowledgement. Julia, you can go back to the classroom now. I'll handle this matter. I nodded and left. As soon as I stepped outside, I saw Mike waiting by the office door. I know he was worried about me. When I returned to the classroom, the girl in front of me turned around and asked, "The head teacher called you in to talk about you and Stanley, right?" Before I could respond, she continued, "Actually, we've all noticed that Stanley likes you. He often steals glances at you during class and always follows you around." I smiled indifferently. Is that so? She nodded, but Mike started to get impatient and reminded her, "Class is starting." The girl pouted, glanced at Mike with a complicated expression, and reluctantly turned back around. Chapter 7. On Saturday, Mike had a physics competition. In the year since I've been reborn, we've been almost inseparable. Good luck, I said as I watched Mike enter the venue. I had just sat down on a bench outside the venue when a shadow fell over me. Julia. I didn't look up, but I knew from the voice it was Stanley. He was holding a clear bag with his competition entry documents inside. Clearly, he was also here for the competition. Stanley crouched down in front of me, looking up at me. Julia, can we talk? What bad luck. I stood up, trying to distance myself from him, but then I heard his threatening words from behind me. If you don't want to talk, I'll go inside and find Mike. If I tell just one little lie, he can kiss this final goodbye. What do you want to talk about? I interrupted him, annoyed. Since being reborn, I've always thought this man was despicable, but in front of me, he always tried to act pitiful. Stanley stepped closer, nervously clenching his hands at his sides. I'm sorry for what happened in our past life. I never intended for your dad's company to go bankrupt, and I never thought you'd die in that car accident. Julia, I admit that when I first approached you, I had ulterior motives. But later on, I genuinely fell for you. I was just too eager. I only wanted to make myself strong enough to be worthy of you. I glanced at the digital clock above the venue entrance. There was only 1 minute left before the competition started. After that, Stanley wouldn't be able to enter and disrupt Mike anymore. You have no idea how I survived after you died. The engagement was fake. From beginning to end, I only ever loved you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have lived such a reckless life after losing you and ended up dying just a few years later to see you again. At this point, he smiled bitterly, almost mockingly. And I hadn't responded to him once during the entire conversation. His lies wouldn't even fool a dog. A dog would shake its head after hearing them. If you love someone, how could you bear to drag her into the mud? Julia, please forgive me. Can we start over? As I watched the security guard close the gate to the venue, I finally smiled, satisfied. All right, now you can't go in. Stanley didn't even turn around. He just looked at me, his voice haunting. I figured you'd be here with Mike today, so you were always my target. Oh. I walked over to the security guard, and Stanley followed. But that played right into my hands. Sir, this man is harassing me, I said, feigning fear as I sought help from the security guard. Sure enough, the guard stepped in to protect me. I had a feeling you were up to no good, kid. Stanley tried to explain, but in the end, the guard still chased him away. Chapter 8. After finding out that Mike won first place in the physics competition and got a guaranteed admission to B University, my dad and Aunt May were so happy they couldn't sleep for several nights. Our Mike is just so smart, my dad said, then glanced at me. And our Julia is smart too. Look how much you've improved in such a short time. I smiled without saying anything. I thought that since Mike had secured his spot, he might not go back to school anymore. But the next day, he still left for school with me. Until the college entrance exams are over, I have to make sure you study well, Mike explained. In the 2 months leading up to the exams, everyone in the family was anxious, except for me. To save time, Mike suggested we eat lunch in the school cafeteria. This way, you'll have more time to rest at noon, instead of running back and forth. Halfway through our meal, Stanley suddenly sat down next to me. Mike and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us acknowledged him. Julia, don't be picky. You have to eat your carrots, they're good for your eyes, Mike said. Stanley suddenly spoke up, Julia doesn't like carrots. Originally, I wasn't planning to eat them, but after hearing what he said, I immediately ate all the carrots on my plate right in front of him. Stanley's expression hardened. By the time we finished eating and left, he had barely touched his own meal. That afternoon, while doing practice problems, Mike suddenly asked me, Julia, besides carrots, is there anything else you don't like to eat? There is. I nodded seriously and then listed a bunch of foods I didn't like. After I finished, Mike chuckled, our family really had a hard time raising you. The next day at lunch, Mike left early. When I looked up after finishing my test paper, the classroom was empty. At this time, the line at the cafeteria would be long. As I hesitated about whether to go out and buy something quick to eat, Stanley placed a sandwich and milk on my desk. I noticed you didn't go to lunch, so I brought this for you. Just as I was about to show my annoyance, the next second, someone else shoved the items back into Stanley's arms. My sister doesn't eat this stuff. Then, right in front of Stanley, Mike opened a thermos full of my favorite dishes. Sis, from now on, I'll go home during the second period every day and bring you lunch. Since he got the guaranteed admission, the teachers weren't too strict with him, but isn't that too much trouble? Mike lay on the table, watching me eat, and smiled, it's not a hassle, I like cooking. You made this yourself? I raised an eyebrow. Yes, do you like it? I nodded sincerely, it's delicious. At the senior year oath-taking assembly, Mike gave a speech on stage. As I watched the confident young man, I couldn't quite put my feelings into words. In my previous life, I had also attended this assembly, and Mike was the one giving the speech then too. But my mindset was entirely different back then. You're not seriously falling for a 17 or 18-year-old kid, are you? A mocking voice next to me brought me back to reality. Julia, wake up. You've lived 2 lives, mentally, you're worlds apart from Mike, a little kid. You're not suitable for him. Besides, he's still your. I didn't give him the chance to finish. I shot him a disgusted look and sneered, so who am I suitable for? You. Stanley seemed oblivious to the sarcasm in my words. He looked into my eyes and said seriously, Julia, I'm the one you've loved for over a decade. We have shared experiences, we understand each other. No one in this world is more suitable for you than me. This guy has some nerve. Seeing Mike step down from the stage, I knew he didn't like Stanley being around me, and I felt the same. Eager to get rid of him, I said, who I like has nothing to do with you. Instead of worrying about me, maybe you should worry about yourself. Life in the Smith family hasn't been easy this time around, has it? That hit a nerve. Stanley's face darkened, and after a long pause, he finally said, I don't care about those things anymore. I'm back for you. I asked him, do you even believe that nonsense yourself? Chapter 9. On the day of the college entrance exam, Mike, who had already been accepted through early admission, was more nervous than I was. Sis, check again to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. This was the 4th time he'd asked me to check, but I obediently went through my stuff once more. After the last exam, Mike, Dad, and Aunt May were all waiting for me outside. That evening, the classmates organized a dinner, and as the only one in the class who had been accepted into B University, Mike was naturally the center of attention and drank a lot. When we got out of the taxi outside our neighborhood, I took a few steps forward and realized Mike wasn't following me. Turning back, I saw him still standing where we had gotten out, looking at me from a distance. Sis, I'm drunk, and my head feels dizzy. Come over here and hold my hand, okay? I was in a good mood today. I walked over with a smile and held his hand. Better now? Maybe it was the alcohol, but Mike's face was very red. He looked down at our clasped hands, and after walking for a while, he quietly said, His tone was light, and the smile never left his face. Until we ran into Stanley in the neighborhood. Stanley's gaze fell on our intertwined hands, and his eyes instantly turned red. He choked out, "Julia?" He charged at us like a madman, looking at Mike and then at me, disbelief written all over his face. "You too?" Mike tightened his grip on my hand, glared at Stanley, and said provocatively, "Sis, why does he keep haunting us?" At that moment, he wasn't drunk at all. His head wasn't dizzy either, he was completely sober. I ignored Stanley and walked past him. At the entrance to our house, I finally let go of Mike's hand and said with a smile, "Nice acting." Mike squeezed the hand I had released, and his ears turned red. My 18th birthday was celebrated along with a graduation banquet. Even though my college entrance exam scores only qualified me for an average university, Dad still went all out and threw a banquet. He proudly bragged to everyone he met, "My daughter got into her dream university, she's amazing." The regret of my previous life was finally made up for in this one, and I became the pride of my father. At the banquet, the Smith family tried to establish a connection with us. "Director York, your daughter is around the same age as my sons. Perhaps we could arrange a match?" Dad didn't even glance at the three people standing behind Stanley's father. He politely declined with a smile. "Young people these days prefer to choose their partners freely. I have some means, so I don't need my daughter to marry for alliance." I noticed that Stanley's expression froze when he heard my dad's words. He must have remembered how in my previous life, Dad had treated him as a distinguished guest because I liked him, actively introducing him to prominent figures. But now, he could only stand behind his two brothers, an insignificant background figure. After the guests had all left, Aunt May brought out the birthday cake she and Mike had made together. Just as I was about to make a wish, Mike suddenly said, "Mom, can you and Uncle go turn off the lights?" Everyone in the family was in high spirits that night. They didn't think much of Mike's request and went to turn off the lights. As soon as the lights went out, I closed my eyes to make a wish. But then I heard Mike's calm voice, "Sis, happy birthday." He gently brushed the hair from my face and tucked it behind my ear. "After today, you'll be an adult. This is the last time I'll call you sis." Before I could fully grasp what he meant, the lights came back on. The whole family started singing the birthday song, and Mike's words were temporarily pushed to the back of my mind. Chapter 10. The first thing I heard after waking up in the morning was the sound of a fight outside. Dad and Aunt May weren't home, and when I called out for Mike, I got no response. Puzzled, I went downstairs and saw Mike and Stanley entangled outside the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked around and grabbed a bottle of red wine from the liquor cabinet before rushing out. I pushed Stanley away and stood in front of Mike, shielding him. "Are you out of your mind?" In my 2 lifetimes, this was the first time I had ever cursed at someone. Mike, standing behind me, tilted his head and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked coldly at Stanley. "You went through all this trouble to provoke me, to get into a fight with me, just so Julia would come out and see you. Satisfied now?" Stanley noticed the bottle I was holding in my hand. He wasn't stupid, he could guess it was intended to be used on him. Instantly, the expression on his face became desolate, and the pain in his eyes was evident. But I remained unmoved and said coldly, "Stanley, people need to learn how to move on. Stop clinging to the past. Acting like this only makes me despise you more. Don't ever appear in front of me again. Otherwise, I'll make sure you never set foot in North City again." After pulling Mike inside, I scolded him, "So, you're tough now, huh? You've even learned to fight? And what did you just call me? Julia? Is that a name you should be using?" Mike cautiously glanced at me, avoiding my gaze. "I told you last night, that was the last time I'd call you sis." As if struggling with something, he turned back to look seriously into my eyes. "Julia, you're an adult now. I won't call you sis anymore." I like you, so I don't want to just see you as a sister. His words rooted me to the spot, and it took a long time for me to come to my senses. That evening, the atmosphere at the dinner table was extremely awkward. My dad and Aunt May tried to ease the tension between Mike and me, but it didn't help. After walking the dog, I came back to find Mike and Aunt May just coming out of my dad's study, both looking somewhat off. I was about to ask what happened when my dad came out too. Julia, come to my study. Inside, my dad started talking about how my mom died in childbirth when I was born and how, all these years, he always feared he hadn't taken good enough care of me. But my Julia is amazing, not just in academics but in everything else too. I could tell he was beating around the bush, so I cut straight to the point. Dad, what is it you're trying to say? What happened? He sighed. After you left, Mike asked his mother and me to come to the study. He said he likes you and wants to be with you. In fact, I've noticed for a while that he feels differently about you, but I just never thought about it this way. My dad carefully observed my expression. Seeing that I hadn't responded, he continued, Julia, your father and Aunt May are open-minded parents. If you like Mike too, you don't need to worry about our feelings. Even though Aunt May just gave Mike a beating, she, like me, will respect your choices. Dad can even send you both abroad, to a place where no one knows you. My only wish in this lifetime is for you to be happy and live a joyful life. I never doubted my dad's love for me. Even in my past life, when I turned into the wreck Stanley described, he never once said a harsh word to me. Dad, I said seriously, holding his hand, I'm not going anywhere. I just want to stay here with you. As for Mike and me, I'll handle it. Chapter 11. During the summer break, instead of traveling, I went straight to intern at my dad's company. By the time I officially joined after graduation, I had already earned a good reputation within the company. Mike didn't join my dad's company. He's smart and started his own business while still in college. With my dad's support, Mike's company is now gaining traction. I saw Stanley again at a charity gala. Without my help in this life, he remains a bastard child in an awkward position. When Stanley saw me, a smile spread across his face. He was about to come over to greet me, but a staff member stopped him. Sir, this is the VIP area. You can't enter. Please return to your seat. Now, he can no longer pester me, and it's difficult for him even to catch a glimpse of me. Some big shots nearby, whom I knew, mentioned Stanley. That Smith family bastard is into some new energy thing lately. He even came to my company seeking investment. I heard about that too. Are you investing, John? Sigh, it's hard to refuse because of the Smith family's face. Besides, new energy is definitely a big trend in the future. From their conversation, I learned that Stanley and Mike were working in the same field. I raised my eyebrows and smiled, taking the initiative to greet the boss beside me. Uncle John, long time no see. I just heard you talking about new energy. My brother is also in this field. If you're considering investing, I'll thank you on his behalf. Uncle John and the others smiled and nodded. Julia, since you've mentioned it, how could we not support Mike? These men have been in business for decades. They could easily grasp the underlying message in my words. Besides, the York family has been doing better and better in recent years, so they're happy to do me a favor. After today, Stanley won't be able to secure a single investment in North City. That's the difference between us now. I don't have to lift a finger to make his fate vastly different from his previous life. And with just a few light words, I can push him to the bottom, where he'll never recover. Chapter 12. Mike's company went public in the US after it was renamed. Seeing the news online, I couldn't help but frown. He had renamed the company J-Y, which is the abbreviation of my name. The day Mike returned to the country, I personally went to the airport to pick him up and threw a stack of documents at him. Mike, you're getting bolder and bolder. Mike caught the papers with a smile, flipped through a few pages, then looked into my eyes. So you found out? Julia, J-Y is your dowry. Can you reconsider me? I slammed the car door shut, gritting my teeth as I squeezed out my answer, no. The stack of documents was actually a stock transfer agreement, with Mike transferring 70% of J-Y shares to me. I've known him for 2 lifetimes, yet it seems like I never really understood Mike. It's as if he's no longer the Mike I knew back in high school. In the car, it was just the two of us. After a few seconds of silence, I finally heard Mike's voice. "Julia, can you give me one reason? Why not me?" His voice was filled with melancholy, making my heart ache. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and then started telling him about that past life dream I had once mentioned to him. "Don't look at it as if we're only 2 months apart. In reality, I've always seen you as just a little kid. When you talked to my dad after the college entrance exams, I just thought you were acting on a whim." Mike sat up straight, turned to me, and said, "Julia, it's been 9 years since that summer after senior year. Why won't you believe me?" He sounded like he was accusing me, his voice filled with an indescribable sense of grievance. "Are you afraid that it's just a passing fancy? From 17 until now at 26, I've been following you around for 9 years. After this birthday, it'll be 10 years. I only have so many decades in my life. How could this possibly be just a fleeting impulse?" As the car passed through the tunnel, I glanced at Mike in the rearview mirror. The light inside the tunnel flickered on and off across his face. "Julia, can you give me a chance? I know what I want." He said this while facing the window, his voice choking with emotion. My heart suddenly skipped a beat. "Okay." It wasn't until after I spoke that I realized what I had done, but there was no taking it back. Mike's previously somber face instantly lit up. He rubbed his eyes and asked uncertainly, "Really?" But before I could answer, he continued, "Don't think about going back on your word, I heard it anyway." As we exited the tunnel, I glanced up at the sky. The moon was full, and the stars were shining. Suddenly, I felt that agreeing to give things a try with Mike wasn't such a bad idea after all.